beginning to find out that more and more people that we didn't really know were Calvinists are Calvinists, and they're becoming more aggressive in pushing this doctrine. John MacArthur, for example. Many people didn't know that, but if you look at his writings, and J.I. Packer, D. James Kennedy, of course, because Presbyterians are Calvinists. What began to concern us a bit are some of the claims. And let me just quote. Calvinism, I'm quoting some Calvinists now, quote, Calvinism is pure biblical Christianity in its clearest and purest expression. Well, then if you're not a Calvinist, you're not a Christian, it seems to follow. John Piper, I imagine that name would be known at least to some of you, he writes, quote, the doctrines of grace, that is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, perseverance of the saints, are the warp and woof of the biblical gospel cherished by so many saints for centuries. So if Calvinism, the 5 points of Calvinism are the warp and woof of the biblical gospel, and you don't preach 5-point Calvinism, wouldn't it then follow you're not preaching the gospel? Now it becomes rather serious. Your own C.H. Spurgeon, by the way, most of you don't know, and I rarely mention this, my father named me after Charles Spurgeon. My father named me David Charles Haddon Spurgeon Hunt. My mother thought Spurgeon was a bit too much, and she redlined that one. So my name actually is David Charles Haddon Hunt, okay? So Spurgeon and I should get along well. Spurgeon wrote, I do not ask whether you believe Calvinism. It is possible you may not, but I believe you will before you enter heaven. I am persuaded that as God may have washed your hearts, he will wash your brains before you enter heaven. John Gerstner says, we believe, with the great Baptist preacher Charles Haddon Spurgeon, that Calvinism is just another name for Christianity. I'll just give you some other quotes. I mean, I would think your level of concern would rise a bit. Another Calvinist says this teaching was held to be the truth by the apostles. Another Calvinist says Christ taught the doctrines which have come to be known as the 5 points of Calvinism. Another one says, well, this is a man named Copps, a well-known Calvinist. God's plan of salvation revealed in the Scriptures consists of what is popularly known as the 5 points of Calvinism. Lorraine Bettner, one of the great apologists against the Roman Catholic Church, says, quote, the great advantage of the Reformed faith is that in the framework of the 5 points of Calvinism, it sets forth clearly what the Bible teaches concerning the way of salvation. Another one says, quote, if you do not know the 5 points of Calvinism, you do not know the gospel, but some perversion of it. B.B. Warfield, one of the classics, says Calvinism is evangelicalism in its purest and only stable expression. Another one says Calvinism is the gospel, and to teach Calvinism is in fact to preach the gospel. Well, I would think some of you might be a bit concerned now that you haven't preached the gospel yet, if you haven't been preaching Calvinism. It's called Reformed theology. I get just a little bit upset about that. They've hijacked the Reformation. What do you mean Reformed theology? John Calvin was 8 years old when Martin Luther nailed his 95 Theses to the door of the Wittenberg Castle Chapel. There's a lot more to the Reformation than Calvinists. There were the Mennonites, there were the Zwinglians, and I mean there were a number of others. And now to say that this is Reformation doctrine, this is it, they've hijacked the Reformation. Then again, they will say, you're not a Calvinist, you reject the Great Reformation creeds. I don't know how many of you have heard that. I've had that accusation many times. Oh, you reject the Great Reformation creeds. Reformation creeds? What do you mean, Reformation creeds? What are the Great Reformation creeds? Oh, well, they're talking about, you British are responsible for part of it, the Westminster Assembly. The Westminster Confession of Faith, right here in England, or the Synod of Dort in Dortmund, Holland. Well, as a matter of fact, this was a state church. And let me just quote some historians for you about this. In 1643, I'm quoting G.T. Bethany, in 1643, the Westminster Assembly of Divines was convened by Parliament to reform the Church of England. And now we've got Parliament is in charge. And I don't know if you would want Parliament to be in charge of reforming your evangelical church today. They paid the salaries, they paid the expenses of these people. He goes on, he talks about ejections of Episcopalians from their livings amounted to some thousands. So many vacancies were created, they could not be filled. He says the Presbyterians predominated in Parliament and in 1648 showed their continued intolerance by enacting that all who denied God or the Trinity or the atonement or the canonical books of Scripture or the resurrection of the dead and a final judgment were to suffer the pains of death, as in case of felony, without benefit of clergy. A long catalogue of heresies of the second class was specified to be punished by imprisonment. In other words, this was a state church, and they were enforcing it on everyone. And if you did not agree with them, you were thrown out. And in some cases, killed. In many cases, imprisoned. I'm quoting another historian who says, the Westminster Assembly was called and financed by Parliament and was controlled by Presbyterians. Baptists and Independents were excluded by design. In fact, Baptists and Independents were regarded as, quote, mortal enemies of the state church, unquote. Tolerance for any religious belief other than Calvinism was denounced by leading members of the assembly as, quote, the last and strongest hold of Satan. Wow. The assembly was determined to enforce its brand of religion upon the entire population. This happened here in England. Now you have a wonderful man. The letters of Samuel Rutherford, I'm sure many of you have read them. I mean, so beautiful. And historians describe Rutherford as, quote, a gracious and godly man, unquote. Yet because of his Calvinist beliefs, he denied absolutely the moral principles underlying religious tolerance. Sounding like the popes and the Vatican he despised, he even went so far as to declare, quote, there is but one true church, and all who are outside of it are heretics who must be destroyed. Is that what Calvinism does to an otherwise very godly, loving, and gracious man? Roger Williams, one of the best-known advocates of religious freedom in his day, published a protest titled The Bloody Tenet, means bloody tenet, of persecution for cause and conscience. He fled England for America, where he was badly treated by the Puritans. In England, the Westminster Assembly had his book publicly burned. In 1648, the Presbyterians succeeded in enacting the gag law to punish the Baptists as blasphemers and heretics. I find it rather ironic that many Baptists today are Calvinists. Under this infamous law, 400 Baptists were thrown into prison. In fact, dissenters had been suffering persecution and imprisonment for years. Now, you all know what happened under Bloody Mary and the persecution and burning at the stake of over 400 evangelicals for rejecting, transubstantiation. But maybe most of you didn't know about this persecution by the Calvinists. Protestants suffering at the hands of fellow Protestants for not being Calvinists. Nearly 30 years before, the following entreaty titled, quote, "A most humble supplication of many of the King's Majesty's loyal subjects who are persecuted only for differing in religion contrary to divine and human testimonies." That's the title he gave his letter. It was smuggled out of prison. And listen to what he said. "Our miseries are long and lingering imprisonments for many years in divers counties of England, in which many have died and left behind them widows and many small children, taking away our goods, not for any disloyalty to your majesty, nor hurt to any mortal man, but only because we dare not assent unto and practice in the worship of God such things as we have not faith in, because it is a sin against the Most High." This is not the Catholics who are persecuting them. This was Protestant England now, and they were being persecuted for not embracing Calvinism. Calvinism has been imposed on the Bible, and they have this framework of belief, and now they try to interpret the Bible in such a way that it says what they want it to say. Now, Calvinism comes from Augustine. All of the Calvinists acknowledge this. Calvin quotes Augustine in his Institutes, about that thick, which I've gone through very carefully. John Calvin quotes Augustine more than 400 times, including phrases such as, "by the authority of Augustine." Spurgeon said, quote, "Calvin derived it," that is Calvinism, "mainly from the writings of Augustine." John Calvin said, "Augustine is so wholly with me that if I wished to write a confession of my faith, I could do so with all fullness and satisfaction to myself out of his writings." I quote many Calvinists in the book who, just one after another, says, well, R.C. Sproul says, quote, "Augustinianism is presently called Calvinism or Reformed theology." They all acknowledge John Calvin is not the originator of Calvinism, but John Calvin got this doctrine from Augustine, and Augustine was the first one who came up with these ideas. Well, who was Augustine? Well, some of you may know that he's one of the four, well, we have some ex-Catholics here, I would think you would know. He's one of the original four doctors of the church. They have a feast day, August 28th, the day of his death. In 1986, the Pope celebrated the 1600th anniversary of his conversion. He quoted one of the things that Augustine said. Augustine said, quote, "I should not believe the gospel unless moved to do so by the authority of the church." I've had a Catholic apologist quote that to me to confirm the authority of the Catholic Church. This is where our authority comes from. Sir Robert Anderson said, quote, "The Roman Catholic Church," another one of your own here in Britain, "the Roman Catholic Church was molded by Augustine into the form it has ever since maintained. Of all the errors that later centuries developed, scarcely one cannot be found in embryo in his writings. Among them you would have infant baptism for salvation, the necessity of baptism for salvation. Salvation is only in the church and its sacraments. Persecution of all who reject this teaching. The acceptance of the Apocrypha. Allegorical interpretation of the Bible." You don't take the first few chapters of Genesis seriously. This is allegory, and they allegorize much else. It comes from Augustine. He rejected the millennium, the literal reign of Christ upon the earth. Actually, we're in the millennium now. You read that in his book, The City of God. Satan is locked up, in case you hadn't noticed that. And the church is in the process of taking over. You know, this sort of thing is the kingdom dominion teaching now among many charismatics, that we're going to take over. This all comes from Augustine, but it is very Catholic. Historian Philip Schaff says, quote, he calls Augustine, quote, the first real Roman Catholic, the principal theological creator of the Latin Catholic system as distinct from evangelical Protestantism. Pardon me. Let me quote John Piper. I can find it quickly here. John Piper says, now this is shocking, and one of my chapters is titled, I guess I don't call it the shocking, the surprising Roman Catholic connection. Listen to Piper, and they all agree on this. The standard text on theology that Calvin and Luther drank from was Sentences by Peter Lombard. 9/10 of this book consists of quotations from Augustine. Luther was an Augustinian monk, and Calvin immersed himself in the writings of Augustine, as we can see from the increased use of Augustine's writings in each new edition of the Institutes. Paradoxically, one of the most esteemed fathers of the Roman Catholic Church gave us the Reformation. Ooh, isn't that amazing? The two best-known fathers of the Protestant Reformation, Calvin and Luther, were heavily under the influence of Augustine, the premier Roman Catholic. That's a little bit shocking, isn't it? Now that would explain to you why Reformed churches today still believe in infant baptism for salvation. So we have something rather astonishing. The Catholic connection to both Calvin and Luther, and what it has left in the so-called Reformed churches through the Reformation process. Now, Augustine was called the father of the Inquisition. He was a Constantinian. Remember Constantine, the Roman emperor? He gave freedom to the Christians. I mean, what's the point of persecuting the Christians? I mean, they don't get drunk. They don't carouse. They're honest. They're moral. They're hard workers. Why are you killing them? Maybe some of this will rub off on the rest of them. They're good citizens. And he was not a Christian. He continued to offer sacrifices to pagan deities. He continued to preside over the pagan feasts as head of the Pontifical College. He didn't stop the sacrifices to the great goddess Vesta, put out the Vestal Virgins. He had the sun god, not the Son of God, on his coins and so forth. That's Constantine. All he was interested in was uniting his empire. And if you want to study ecumenism, study Constantine. He's the first ecumenist. He called the Great Ecumenical Council, 325 AD, the Council of Nicaea. He presided over it, gave the opening speech, and so forth. And he thought, by giving freedom to these Christians, he could unite his empire. To his shock, he found out these Christians are divided. They don't get along with one another. And so he called the Council of Nicaea to straighten out certain things, and he imposed, finally, you will agree or else. And that's what Augustine did. So now you would understand a little bit, and I don't know, the Calvinists get upset with me by going to Geneva, pointing out what happened in Geneva. John Calvin would flog you, torture you. They tortured people. They burned more than 60 people at the stake in Geneva under John Calvin. Talk about thought police. They knock on your door. You got too many dishes on the table. A lady that had her hair bouffant a little bit too high in jail and so forth. The death penalty for many crimes, a child that bad-mouthed its parents had its head cut off. So John Calvin, because he believes in a God who forces people into heaven with irresistible grace, it's called, and a God who doesn't care that millions, probably billions, go to hell. In fact, he has predestined them to go there and has made it out so that they can't even understand the gospel. He will not give them the grace they need to understand and to believe. Well, I think maybe that would flavor your actions, wouldn't it? And I have Calvinists who try to defend John Calvin. And they say, well, yeah, but you know, everybody did it in those days. The popes were doing it and so forth. And wait a minute. 1 John chapter 2, John says, he that says he abides in him, that is in Christ, ought himself so to walk as he walked. It doesn't matter what society you live in, what time in history you live in. Is not my life supposed to reflect Christ living in me? But I don't think you would find that in John Calvin. Oh, he was very kind. He prayed a lot. He wore himself out preaching sermons. He also tortured those who disagreed. He also banished them, flogged them, and so forth. Well, that comes from Augustine, who's been called the father of the Inquisition. Well, that goes to the heart of the issue. What love is this? God is love. And you can get in lengthy discussions with Calvinists, and you can go round and round on the finer points of doctrine. Let me just point this out. The bottom line, what all of their arguments are aimed at, is to prove to you that God does not love everyone, that God does not want everyone in heaven, that Christ did not die for everyone, but that in fact God is pleased to damn millions, and you would have to say billions, to hell. And John Calvin said, it is to the glory of God. It is his good pleasure that he damns so many. So we have to decide. And this is the issue in essence. Does God love everyone? God is love, the Bible says. How can you interpret predestining multitudes to eternal torment as being kind? That's not a matter of God's sovereignty, understand. God has the right to send anybody to hell that he wants to, right? We would agree with that. He's sovereign. I can't argue. In fact, we all deserve to go to hell, right? That's not the issue. The issue is God kind? Is he loving? I don't think it's loving to send people to hell, predestine them to go to hell. They can't even believe the gospel. They don't have a chance. Well, we'll get more into that. I think it's a misrepresentation of God. Well, it gets into other problems here, such as the Calvinist says God only knows the future because he has predestined the future. Wait a minute. That's limiting God's omniscience. God is not omniscient if he can only know what he himself has predestined. And so they argue, if man has a free will, then he could surprise God. You have a teaching like that in America. I don't know whether it's gotten here yet. It's called The Openness View of God. Gregory Boyd, a Baptist pastor, is teaching it. YWAM, Youth with a Mission, maybe you're not aware of it. They have taught that for many years, at least going back 30, no, more than that, 30 years. Gordon Olson, a gentleman, was teaching it many years ago. Joy Dawson has taught it for many years. God is surprised. He doesn't really know what's going to happen, but when it happens, then he, as God, he steps in and tries to deal with it. But the Bible very clearly says, known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the cosmos, right? Well, how could God know everything he's going to do if he doesn't know some things that men are going to do? And then he wouldn't be able to tell in advance what he's going to do in order to respond to what man is going to do. Well, yeah, but wait a minute now. Look, if God knows what Mr. Jones is going to do tomorrow, and God can't be wrong, so what God knows Mr. Jones is going to do tomorrow, he's going to have to do tomorrow. Then how can Mr. Jones have a free will if God already knows what he's going to do? Well, the philosophers have discussed that for centuries. It's a very simple problem. Another one of your own, John Wesley, I think about 1780, he preached a sermon in which he said, I mean, the man was right up to date on this for sure, right up to date with modern science. The latest physicists would agree with this. Time is part of this physical universe. When the Bible says, in the beginning, I think Job would agree with me, I hope. It's the beginning of time. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, and part of what he created was time. It's part of this physical universe. God is not part of this physical universe. That's pantheism. This universe is separate and distinct from God. He didn't create it out of himself. He created it out of nothing. So time has nothing to do with God. He's timeless. I am that I am. And so John Wesley very accurately said, God observes everything from outside. He sees past, present, and future. What is past, present, future to us? He sees it as already, as it is. So the fact that God knows what Mr. Jones is going to do tomorrow does not cause Mr. Jones to do it, has no influence whatsoever upon what Mr. Jones is going to do. Well, we have a problem. How do you know you're one of the elect? You are saved eternally if you're one of the elect. I mentioned that I concluded I'm a zero-point Calvinist because I believe in eternal security for the wrong reason. All the arguments that Calvinists will engage in, all he'll go to, and we go to Romans chapter 9. What about Esau and Jacob? As it is written, Jacob have I loved, but Esau have I hated. Well, it's very clear. As it is written. Where is it written? Go find out where it is written. It's only written in one place. That's in Malachi. Not in the Old Testament. Never said that in the Old Testament. And it's very clear in Malachi, it is talking about the nations descended from Jacob and Esau. It is not talking about the salvation of either individual. It's very clear. Go back, and I go back, and I don't find that the Calvinists quote this verse where God said, before she gave birth to Jacob and Esau, God said to Rebekah, 2 nations are struggling in your womb. The elder shall serve the younger. If that was about the 2 individuals, Jacob and Esau, it was a false prophecy because the elder never served the younger in their lifetime, those individuals. But it's very true of the nations that descended from them. What about Pharaoh and so forth? Well, you go into all these arguments with them, and what is the goal of the Calvinists? What are all the arguments, all of the turning to the Greek and the Hebrew and all the complexities, and they're going to just overwhelm you with all of this? They've studied this so much, and you haven't. What is the bottom line? All of their arguments have one purpose: to prove God doesn't love everybody, to prove Christ didn't die for everybody, to prove that God is not kind to everyone, and in fact that he delights in sending multitudes to hell. What love is this? God is love. Love is kind. I think it's a misrepresentation of the God of the Bible, but you will have to come to your own conclusion as a good Berean.